Good morning, 10th graders. This is your last English class before spring break, so hopefully you can get everything done, and then you don't have to have English class until Monday the 20th. I'm going to quickly go over things that are due this week. That way we can spend the rest of this video on your close read. Please make sure that you put your name on your Roots notebook and your writing journal. Some of you still haven't done that, even though I've said it 12 billion times by now. So pause the video, go check, make sure that you have done that. Today you have to do a journal. You do that every English class day, so that should be kind of a routine. You have a close reading of the script for Hotel Rwanda, and then you need to make sure that your No Red Ink grammar practice is done. I told you you could split that between Monday and Wednesday if you'd like to, but it's due by the end of today. So all of those things due by 11:59 p.m. today. All late work from weeks 1 and 2, and this is our third week, any late work that you have needs to be in to me by tomorrow night at 11:59 p.m. So I will accept any work from week 1, 2, or 3 up until tomorrow night at 11:59 p.m. That is when spring break starts, and I'm going to be getting all my grades in hopefully on Friday, so I'm not going to accept any grades for weeks 1, 2, or 3 after that. Because I don't want you to have to be working on any of it over spring break, and also I want to enjoy my spring break, and then we will reconvene after that. Okay, so let's take a look at your close reads. I'm actually going to give you a brief history of kind of what was going on in this time period so that it all kind of makes a lot more sense to you. So this is based on the screenplay for the movie Hotel Rwanda, and so some of this is not going to make any sense to you without any historical context. So I'm going to try to make this quick, but it's going to be a little bit lengthy, this particular portion of it. So Hotel Rwanda is all about the genocide that happened in Rwanda in 1994. Basically, a genocide, which we've talked about before, is the attempt to basically extinguish an entire people group based on some ethnicity or race or religion or something like that, some particular thing. It's trying to get rid of them in their entirety. So in this particular case, there were two groups in Rwanda. Mostly, there was a third one that was very minor, but they're the Hutus and the Tutsis, and basically they're different tribal groups that until the time of European colonialism, they interacted and things like that, but it wasn't necessarily in a negative way. So back in the Berlin Conference, which basically split Africa into different, or different parts of Africa were given to different European nations to colonize. Rwanda was given to the Germans, and basically the Germans went in and favored the Tutsi people over the Hutus, even though that they were a minority there, and that preference kind of gave them a little bit of animosity between the two groups. And then Belgium took over after World War II and continued that kind of animosity by favoring the Tutsis and putting them in high places in government and things like that, until in the 1960s they made a decision to reverse basically the standings, and they put the Hutus in charge of the government, and the Tutsis were then marginalized and persecuted because of all the time that they had spent kind of in charge before this. And as a result of that, more than 300,000 of the Tutsi people actually fled and became refugees at a certain time, and they formed in 1990 the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, and basically they started a civil war with the rest of Rwanda to try to gain back some power and to stop the persecution and things like that. And that was formed by the Tutsi people when they were in surrounding countries as refugees. So because of this, there was a lot of fighting back and forth and a lot of retaliation from the Hutus. They would kill some of the Tutsis that were within their own country. And that started back in 1990. And there were a couple of times where they would have ceasefires and talk about possibly having some peace until 1993, when the peace talks actually got very serious. And not everybody was on board for this. The RPF really wanted the peace to happen, and some of the moderate Hutus wanted this to happen, but then extremist groups started to pop up, specifically some youth extremist groups, one of which is the Interahamwe, which is mentioned in your reading. They were a youth extremist group of Hutus, and they had this idea that kind of popped up first in 1992 called the Final Solution, which was basically genocide, which was to just kill all of the Tutsi people because they were a problem, and it was kind of a plague to them to have to deal with the RPF, and they really didn't want peace. They wanted to squash the movement entirely. In fact, the RPF, they were referred to frequently as cockroaches, and anyone who kind of aided them or didn't want to kill them, they were kind of lumped together as a cockroach or as Tutsi sympathizers. So basically, the UN stepped in at this point, and they formed a group that they sent into Rwanda for the purpose of enabling this peace to kind of happen. So both groups came together, they signed these peace accords and said that things were going to change, things were going to be different. Well, this really angered the Hutu extremists who didn't want this to happen, and on April 6th of 1994, when all of this was kind of taking place, they were starting to transition things. The president of Rwanda was actually assassinated in the air. He was in an airplane, and the plane was taken down, and everyone on board died. So, to this day, nobody can quite pinpoint who was responsible for this, whether it was the RPF or whether it was extremists. What we do know, however, is that that happened on April 6th, and then on April 7th, the armies and things like that were ready to begin their genocide. So as soon as people kind of woke up April 7th, they started to broadcast out on the radio that it was time for the final solution and encouraged people to begin taking out anyone who happened to be a Tutsi. And specifically, they had lists that were already compiled of people that were in key positions that needed to be killed first, because when the president died, it created this kind of vacuum of power that needed to be filled. And there were specific people who probably could have kind of created this backing to get into a position of power or office, and so they needed to kind of be killed off first in order to prevent that from happening. So that all happened, and suddenly there was massive slaughter out in the streets. People were dying by the hundreds, and they took over the radios, and the Presidential Guard and the army and the extremist groups were all kind of fighting specifically to kill every single Tutsi that was in the country. Now, the RPF at this time, they were still kind of on the outskirts of Rwanda, and they now begin to kind of fight their way to the capital to kind of take over the government again, to kind of bring peace. At this point, they're not willing to negotiate for peace because they know that there's not really any hope or chance of that. So they are fighting to make their way to Kigali, where the capital is. But in the process of this, the UN, which was there to facilitate peace, the peacekeepers that are on the ground are basically told that they are not allowed to step in the middle of this fight. It was one of their kind of rules for being there, was that they weren't allowed to do anything. So all they could do was get out any foreign nationals. So people who weren't Rwandan, they could take them to safety, but they weren't allowed to aid anyone else, including the Tutsi people who were being slaughtered en masse. So when the UN wasn't willing to step in, not a lot of other countries were willing to step in either. In fact, at this time, at the beginning when this all broke out, the French were actually backing the Rwandan army and sending them weapons at the time to kind of aid them against the RPF during their civil war. So they weren't going to step in either. And the Belgians, who at this point were in charge of the country, also kind of took a step back, and their main focus was getting foreign nationals out of there as well. So at the end of this, they basically end up fighting until July, and as a result, somewhere between 500,000 is a low estimate, all the way up to 1.1 million Tutsi people are killed. That's 70% of their entire population. So that's just the number of people who were killed. There's also other horrific atrocities that kind of happened as well. So your excerpt here is about a man named Paul. He is Hutu, but his wife is Tutsi, so he's considered a traitor. He runs a hotel that is owned by a Belgian company. So he's calling this Belgian company, basically, he has a bunch of Tutsi refugees hiding out in his hotel, and he's calling the Belgians and saying, what can you do? Can you please help us? We're being surrounded. And they are horrified by what's happening, but at the same time, there's not much that they can really do. So, so they're kind of stuck in this place of not mattering enough to anybody to get any kind of help. So, sorry that was a long-winded kind of explanation, but there's so much more detail in there. If you want to look it up, I would highly encourage you to look some of that up, because it seems like all that kind of stuff is crazy. How could that ever happen? But that was really only 26 years ago. I mean, I was already alive when that happened. This isn't some long ago past event. This is very recent that something like this atrocity happened. So I only have a few minutes left of this video. I want to look at one of the questions here, but if I get cut off, I'm going to do one skill focused question. I want you to do 2 of them. You don't need to do number 3. Number 3 is not one that you can do because it requires you to print stuff, and it's all about the screenplay. And then you're going to write your reflection here as well in 8 to 10 sentences. So let's look at a question really fast here. And the one I wanted to look at, it says, in what way does the radio broadcast that Paul and Benedict listened to at the end of the excerpt reinforce what Mr. Tillins had told Paul earlier? Excuse me. And what Mr. Tillins had told him earlier was, sorry, I'm looking. He says he got through to the French president's office. He pleaded. He said, they're cowards, Paul. Rwanda is not worth a single vote to any of them, the French, the British, the Americans. I'm sorry, Paul. Basically telling him that they're on their own and that no help is coming for them. So if you scroll down to the end, the radio broadcast is all about this British reporter and a State Department officer kind of going back and forth over like this terminology of whether this is a genocide, whether these are acts of genocide. And he's asking, do you have to say acts of genocide? And how many of those does it take to make a genocide? And basically this reinforces this idea that nobody at this point is kind of coming up with any solution to this problem. In fact, what they're doing is they're arguing about this wording and the semantics and what to call this act. Instead of brainstorming ideas, they're talking about how the atrocities of this and saying this shouldn't be happening. Who's going to step up? Who's going to do this? They're talking about the guidelines, specific guidance for which words to use in their national broadcast. So they're arguing over wording instead of offering help. Now, those particular people might not be able to do anything, but they're in kind of a position of power where they can kind of call on people to say, hey, we need to stop this. We need to do something. But instead, they're doing what we all get caught up in doing, and that's arguing about something really small and really insignificant. So go ahead and do 2 more skill-focused questions and then answer the writing question in, I think I said 8 to 10, 10 to 12, something like that, sentences. That's it.